Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, An Advanced Guide to Upscaling Your RFP. My name is Kyle Beaulieu, and I'm the Senior Director of Global Ocean Procurement and the Head of Transpacific here at Flexport. Before we begin, let's cover a few housekeeping items. So on your screen, you'll see a sidebar to the right of the main stage. If at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located on the sidebar. You can also ask questions in the Q&A tab on the sidebar. Time permitting, at the end of the presentation, we'll answer some audience questions. And be sure to get your questions in early. You don't have to wait till we get to the Q&A to ask them. You can ask them throughout the session. You can also download a copy of the slide deck in the main menu above your screen, and we will email everyone a copy of the slide deck and a link to the recording tomorrow evening or tomorrow morning. Before we begin, a brief legal note. Please keep in mind that all the information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Now, for our presenters today. So joining me today are our colleagues, Zeid Houssami, VP Global Head of Air Freight, and Bernie Hart, VP Customs and Trade Business Development. For today's agenda, so first we're going to cover state of the market for both ocean and air to help set the scene for this year's RFP season. And then we'll jump into some 2024 RFP expectations. Bernie will discuss the benefits of including customs in your RFP. And then we'll close things out with recommendations and the Q&A session. So first up, for current market conditions, I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of the ocean market. So I'm going to keep this short, despite the fact that a lot is happening in the market. And we're going to focus just on TPEB here for the moment, because when we consider RFPs in the US, we're mostly looking at the TPEB. If you want more on the overall state of the market, recommend checking out last week's FMU webinar. For those of you who did attend, some of this will sound familiar. If not, if you didn't attend, you can check out the recording for that for a more detailed discussion of the market. So as we rounded out 2023, it was honestly looking very optimistic for January and 2024 from a shipping perspective. So capacity was healthy and sailings were more predictable than we'd seen in a couple years. What happened in December with the Red Sea disruption has changed all of that. And so the Red Sea impact is certainly most disruptive on the Far East westbound, India, and Middle East trades, but have no doubt that it is a global network impacting event, and it has brought instability to the TPEB trade as well. And so for January, overall capacity is currently sitting at 80%, which is a drop of roughly 10% from December, and brings January capacity close to October levels when we experienced blanks due to Golden Week. The US East Coast is experiencing the biggest impact of the Red Sea issues, with only 63% of capacity deployed in week 4. We've also seen across trades, whether it's Far East westbound, India, or TPEB, blanks because vessels have shifted from their normal deployment to supplement other trades to deal with the situation. And so though that 80% is a drop from November and December, I think for this, and as we go into 2024, it's worth putting it into perspective. So it is actually in line with total blanks and average deployment that we saw for 2023. The reality is that blanks have become an every week part of shipping, and something that you'll have to plan for in this year's RFP. The reasons have changed by the market. And so if we go back a few years, it was congestion during COVID, right? Those vessels were out of position, they could be in the right place. Now that really cleared itself this year, but we had commercial blanks in place in 2023. And now we have the Red Sea disruption impacting networks and stretching them globally. And so that it will be something we'll have to plan for, and something we'll talk a little bit more in a couple other slides about. And with all that said, total deployment on TPEB trade is still very so from the graph here, you'll see just total TU capacity in January and February since 2021. And you'll see that even despite this, the totals are still higher than both 2022 and 2023 when we had the major impacts of the COVID congestion. Why is that? Quite simply, there's still a lot more vessels on the TPEB trade and larger vessels on the trade, which means that there's more overall capacity. And so blanks, as we saw in 2023, can be from a commercial standpoint to sort of remove some of that capacity and try to balance out supply and demand a little bit more. We're going to see how that kind of played out when we look at rates on this next slide. So across the globe, floating versus fixed has been very dynamic this year. And so here you can see how that has played out in two of the major head haul trades, with Asia to the US West Coast on TPEB and Asia to North Europe on Far East westbound. And so there's really three takeaways from this graph. First, simply, the market has been extremely volatile between supply and demand. So supply in the major trades outstripped demand in 2023, and it's expected to do so again in 2024. So there's not a balance. And without that balance, and something that we discussed in last week's beginner RFP webinar, is fixed rates are not always cheaper than floating. So that's true in a normal year due to seasonality and peak seasons, but it's especially true in years where there's a supply and demand imbalance. Fixed, just quite simply, is not always a cost-saving mechanism, and I think it's something to keep in mind, but it can be a cost consistency mechanism. So that trade-off is something that you'll have to consider as you go through your RFP. And then third and finally, which we see in this big upshot at the end of this graph, the Red Sea disruption has skyrocketed rates. And so they're not at COVID levels, but clearly it's a significant disruption nonetheless. So the situation there has stretched those networks around the world, and carriers are reviewing the position of every vessel and weighing the trade-offs for sending those vessels elsewhere. So though this has only been going on for 5 or 6 weeks, it will certainly impact fixed rates. So at a minimum, from a timeline perspective for when you maybe should sign, if not as well from a rate perspective, because rates are so much higher than we saw them, and this is really the state of the market as we enter this new year. And so even though the TPEB RFP season hasn't quite started for most companies, this event will certainly influence the framework for 2024 rates. And so from a market perspective, there's a lot to consider as you go into 2024 that will impact your routing decisions and whether you should have a fixed or floating rate. And so the ones we can see now are quite, there's quite a lot. So we have the Red Sea situation, right, that we just referred to. We have that 2024 supply is expected to further outstrip demand, which we're going to talk about here in a bit. We have the Panama Canal drought, which you can hear more about in the FMU webinar referenced previously. There's U.S. East Coast labor negotiations coming up next year, and there's alliance reshuffling. And so from all these factors, you'll have to take into account as you balance out the decisions for whether to lock in a rate, what rate you should lock in, or whether you should take more advantage of a hybrid approach to the floating market. And so we'll talk more about a couple of those scenarios in a bit, but for now, let's go over to Zeid to hear about the air freight market.
All right, great. Thank you, Kyle. Hi, everybody. My name is Zeid Houssami, and I lead our air freight product. Going to just spend a few minutes just recapping what happened last year and what you can expect for 2024 as you prepare for your RFQs. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, really, when we look back at 2023, it was really a year of market adjustment. 2022 was obviously inflicted with COVID, and consumer spending was very, very high. Really, what we saw last year is as spending sort of started to shift more over to services, we saw demand levels really, really plummet, which you can see in the second graph. At the same time, a lot of the carriers started adding capacity back into the market. And you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, those trends kind of increasing over the year. Specifically on Transpacific, we saw a lot of the Asian carriers add freighters into the market, pretty much returning us back to levels in 2019. At the same time, demand dropped pretty considerably compared to 2022, really due to spending shifting over to services, things like travel and other non-durable goods. The first half of last year, you can see was very challenging from a demand standpoint. I think the carriers definitely felt that. The back half of 2023, we saw a little bit of a normalization, which was really encouraging. That was primarily driven by e-commerce and perishable goods. A lot of the traditional air freight products, specifically from a technology standpoint, hardware, networking gear, those products continue to be down from a demand standpoint, but there is just a tremendous uptick in terms of just appetite for e-commerce. And you can see that demand has sort of started to normalize over the end of the last year. In fact, in October, demand was actually up 2% compared to the year before. And what we saw in Q4 of last year was more of a return to a traditional peak season, compared to 2019. You can see the impact that had on rates. Really, rates in 21 and 22 from an air freight standpoint were almost at an all-time high. That was really compounded with fuel and jet fuel being extremely high. But you can see what happened in 23 is that those rate levels really started to stabilize. So really, from a procurement standpoint, we saw a ton of customers go out to bid last year and really take advantage of that softening market, and really realize a lot of those savings in 2023. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let's actually talk next about where does the market today compare to pre-pandemic levels? And that's a question that we get a lot from clients is, when will the market get back to where it was in 2019? Well, from a supply standpoint, we are already there. So capacity is pretty much back to where it was from 2019. In fact, we should expect capacity to increase compared to 2019, as we see a lot of additional capacity enter the market, specifically out of China. But really, compared to 2019, it's really back. However, demand is down. So demand is down 8% compared to pre-pandemic levels. And that's really due to what I had said in the previous slide. Really, a lot of the high-tech products are really not shipping as much. Demand is down, and we're seeing that offset with a lot of e-commerce demand. Now, you're probably thinking supply is flat, demand is down. Why are rates going up? That doesn't make any sense. Simple economics would tell you that rates should go down if demand is down and supply is flat. Really, the reason for that is twofold. First off, jet fuel is high compared to 2019. And that's really due to a lot of the geopolitical tension, the war in Ukraine, the war in between Israel and Palestine. That's really driving demand for kerosene products, which is reducing the supply of jet fuel and therefore driving the prices up. The other thing that's sort of compounding this is operating costs of the airline industry, more so related to inflation. So really labor costs, terminal costs, handling costs, all of those input costs really drive up overall operating costs for the airlines, and that as a result really drives rates upwards. So where is the market going? Really, 2024, you can expect a somewhat stable, knock on wood, year. We're anticipating demand to be up about 2 to 3% compared to last year, and supply to be up between 3 to 5% compared to last year, with most of that capacity entering the market in China. We are seeing an increase in shippers actually look to establish more longer term agreements in the form of block space agreements with freight forwarders, really to secure capacity year round. You can expect, again, a traditional peak season, this year starting in September, likely going into the middle of December. And really to create more predictability from a transit time standpoint, we are seeing a lot of e-commerce shippers secure fixed capacity year round to lock in rates in space. And then, Kyle touched on this in the previous couple slides. There are a lot of sort of unknown, factors for this year, things we know today, related to the Red Sea situation, the Suez. Obviously, we've got, some risk with the Panama Canal. There's a lot of things happening and a lot of things that we also don't know that will impact air freight. But just in general, that is driving a lot of factors in the market. But just in general, anticipate, 2024 to be a stable market with a traditional peak season. All right, so we are going to jump into a couple poll questions next. So you can use the chat bar on the right. What we'll do is we'll sort of collect responses and get a pulse check on how everybody's feeling. So first question is, what are your current inventory levels? So you can just jump over to the right and all right, here we go. We got one. So Kyle, I think when we did this back in November, I think the second answer was the most common one, right?
Yeah, so I was just looking at those numbers. We've seen this fluctuate over time for 2023. And yeah, when we looked at in November, I have what I need was sitting around 60% the client base, but over 30% said I have too much or I have too much. So we have seen that fluctuate. We've been doing this almost quarterly, between 5 or 10%. So I'm curious to see if that holds true here, and we
Yeah.
get down to that I have too much of that 20 to 25% range.
It looks like it's settling in pretty consistent with the last one.
Hmm. Yeah, a
Pretty
little
much
bit
in
less
line.
than the I have too much, but would be expected, right, with some of the holiday sales and stuff that we're seeing.
100%, exactly. All right, great. Let's do one more, and we'll jump into the next section. All right. Given the situation in the Red Sea, which is obviously well chronicled, how are you adjusting your RFP strategy?
This is what I would expect or I would recommend, and we'll talk about this a little in a little bit, but so far in the sort of waiting to see how the market develops, right? So if those rate levels come out significantly higher than last year, then I think as an importer, the decision will be, does it make sense to lock those in or to ride out the broader market conditions of the supply outstripping demand?
Yeah, and shippers have a few months, right? Because ocean contracts are typically signed in the April timeframe. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep. So TP, it goes from May 1st through April 30th.
Yeah, good stuff. Looks like we've got a variety of different responses here. All right. So, Kyle, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So in this section, just going to talk a little bit about RFP expectations from an ocean perspective. A couple of them we've already hinted at, so we'll dive into this a little bit more. So first, as we saw from the rate snapshot earlier today, that 2023 supply outstripped demand, which led to more volatile floating rates that dropped lower than the fixed market and brought some consistent inconsistency for all of us in the form of blank sailings. So the situation here doesn't look like it'll improve at all in 2024. In fact, it should only get shipped worse from a supply demand perspective, but potentially better for importers, right? So there's 3 million TEU on the order books for 2024. And so some of these are already vessels that were delayed and were supposed to go into production or be deployed in 2023. So many of them have already been pushed back, and this volume is going to hit in 2024. And this 3 million TEU represents roughly 10% of global 2023 fleet size. And so there's no projections out there that demand will increase by 10% globally, right? So naturally, supply is expected to outstrip demand in 2024. And so what'll happen with most of these deliveries is that they'll actually filter into the larger east-west trades first, and so down to the other trades. And so what I mean by this is that the largest ships will go to Far East westbound first, because they can actually use the largest ships out there across their strings, and then they'll filter down to TPEB, so Transpacific eastbound, and et cetera. So there will be a cascading effect. So those head hauls will sort of feel the influence of this first. But some of those smaller north-south trades will also reap the benefit of this. There will be some offsetting though, and so the most common that we're used to and should be familiar with is scrapping. So there are some vessels that, for lack of a better phrase, the time has come, and so they will be scrapped. But there's also two market conditions that are offsetting these. So again, you've heard it in each slide. Probably here today, but so this Red Sea disruption is the biggest impact at the moment. And so anything on to going Far East westbound or to TPEB, those take 2 extra weeks on average. So if you want to have a weekly sailing, that means you're going to have 2 extra vessels per string to maintain those weekly services. So that will absorb some extra capacity for now. We're already seeing it in the market, right? There's not necessarily commercial blanks out there. They're looking to utilize every ship as they can. The other offsetting factor, at least for the TPEB side of things, is the Panama Canal. Now, this is a distant third from an offsetting setting standpoint, but does remain relevant for the U.S. East Coast because, frankly, just what it means is that not as much tonnage per vessel is available. So those vessels are still deploying, they're still going via the Panama, but there are weight restrictions in place. And so that means that ships can't be quite as full as they would be normally. And so all in all, some of these current market factors will help bring things better into balance. But when you're looking ahead to the new calendar year, you want to gauge how much you want to rely on these factors to offset. Because putting the Red Sea situation aside, the global supply is expected to outstrip demand in 2024, which means that there could be savings on the floating market, unless it's offset by blanks, which you can only blank so much if you want to keep a consistent service. So there's some limits there as well. So for the next couple areas, we're going to talk about areas to just check on and keep an eye on with expected volatility. And so when making RFP decisions or giving information to your provider, let's not forget about your supplier. And so this is important during a normal year, but we especially expect it to be important during 2024, given the volatility. So often the needs of a supplier are lost when you're looking at basic ocean freight, right? If you're just looking at a rate from Shanghai to LA, Shanghai to New York, you're just seeing what that costs. But the supplier needs or limitations might actually impact your purchasing behavior. And so 2 items worth discussing with your supplier, making sure your provider understands the needs for when doing your RFP, are your loading requirements and how much load date volatility can impact the supplier. And so from a loading requirements perspective, the primary question really is, how many containers can your supplier load at a time? And how will you plan around that? So this happens upstream, but it could also be a question for your warehouse downstream. And so container count matters most, we often find with larger importers. And it's because it's important to know, because it helps inform how much variety you need from a service perspective. So if your supplier is expected to get out 10 containers a week, but they can't handle loading all 10 on the same sailing, then you need to consider having multiple sailings as part of your portfolio. And so this could be a big factor in your decision, right? At the lowest rate, you might only have a single carrier backing. If that single carrier only has 1 string and that service per week, that could leave your supply chain in a little bit of a pickle come post May 1st. And so that might require either a multi-provider fixed solution, either multi-alliance or multi-carrier, or a hybrid or fixed or floating rate. With the current market instability to the Red Sea and really just the general blank sitting at 20% of the market, you'll also need a strategy that allows you to work around these disruptions. And so the key thing to know here is how much flexibility is there on load dates with your supplier. One of the benefits of fixed rates overall traditionally was that with a fixed rate, you got a predictable loading schedule. And so when you signed up for a rate, you could expect that same string week over week. So let's say it was a Friday departure, Tuesday in-gate. That's something that you and your supplier could plan around. Now that stability was totally gone in 2023, and it will be gone in 2024 as well. And so this really offsets one of the main benefits of fixed rates. If your supplier has flexible loading dates, then maybe this isn't as big of an issue, right? Because they can deal with vessel delays or blanks as they come up week over week. But if it is a big deal, again, you may have to look at making sure you have a multi-provider solution or fixed floating rate strategy or totally floating rate solution. Floating rates are great if your goal is always just to get your cargo off supplier docks and get the fast transit time available, because floating rates are able to load on the closest immediate sailing. Now, we won't get into as much detail on it here, but it's also worth keeping in mind that there is an alliance reshuffling that will happen in 2025, and that will also impact your loaded dates. So Hapag and Maersk are forming the Gemini cooperation. And so this means that any strings that you plan for the TPEB calendar year will not be the same strings in Q1 2025. So Hapag and Maersk are the first here, but we do expect additional reshuffling out there. So carriers and providers are expected to keep rate commitments overall, but their networks will be in flux in Q1 and Q2 next year. And so depending on the seasonality of your business, that could be a really big impact, right? If you're a summer product line that ships most heavily in the Q1, Q2, you might not actually know what services are out there or available on your network come April, depending on those decisions are made across the different alliances. Next, we're going to look at another area with a little bit of expected volatility this year. IPI routing. So for those shipping to IPIs this year, especially if you're going into the Midwest, you always have to plan and make a decision around your gateways, right? So we're going to touch on briefly what those are this year. A few of these are what you'd come to expect. So the situation via the U.S. West Coast is expected to be much like it has been in prior years, except for without the risk of some of the labor negotiations that we had. So relatively reliable transit time, but U.S. West Coast can have heavier congestion during peak shipping months due to a lot of fast products that ship into the LA area. A lot of times with peak season, the U.S. West Coast is one of the heaviest shipping lanes. It is also traditionally the most expensive routing due to the port costs there and the rail costs from the area. So that dynamic we do expect to remain in 2024. Now, the Canadian and West Coast is also expected to be pretty similar to 2023. So you have the traditional winter storm concerns that can happen up there. But it's also worth noting a trend that we saw in 2023, which is that PNWs generally hit with a lot higher percentage of blocks than other gateways. If you're used to joining our FMU webinars, you'll generally see that the PNW is about 5 to 10% less week over week than the other gateways. Quite frankly, this is partially due to the fact that there's less services there. So for every blank, there's a higher percentage of that market that is removed. Now, a couple of carriers are adding services to the PNW this year, so maybe that'll help balance it out. But one thing to keep in mind. And then the U.S. East Coast. Again, we've talked on this on many slides, but this will have the most volatility this year. And so over the past 5 years, we have seen a portion of the market that has started to switch to reverse IPI or RIPI. But some of those importers are actually already starting to switch back. So there's 3 potential disruptions to the U.S. East Coast this year, right? The Suez, which we're seeing now, the Panama Canal drought, which we're also seeing now, and then the 2024 labor negotiations. And so all of these are mixing into 2024, which does make RIPI less appealing to many importers. If you ship from Southeast Asia or the India subcontinent, your best bet is likely to stick with the U.S. East Coast if you're using this for IPIs. And you'll just have to keep a pulse check on disruptions throughout the year, maybe purchase on the floating market as it's needed. But if you're shipping from China or other parts of Asia above Southeast Asia, then you might want to look at things here and consider, okay, I've had a little bit going RIPI. Given all the disruptions this year, do I want to go back to Canada or PSW? And so that's it for ocean RFP expectations for now. And so we'll turn it over to Bernie to hear about including customs as part of your RFP.
Kyle, thank you very much. Appreciate that. That was extremely informative, both from you and Zeid. So again, what I'm going to talk to you about is including customs in your RFP process. We saw in the polling questions, there's about 36 to 42% of you that are waiting to kind of see what happens. Really don't want you to wait on the customs side of the house because we want you to include customs and think about that from an overall supply chain perspective as we kind of go to the first slide here. And it really is titled, Why Include Customs? And I've got 4 key areas that I want to talk to you about today. The first one is getting a holistic view of your supply chain. So if you think about international trade, it's a closed loop process. It starts with the purchase order and it ends with the final mile of visibility. What you want to be able to do is have all of that in one common look and feel. So if you are heavily focused, obviously, on the freight side of the house, getting your products moved, if it's moving internationally, you've got to cross a border. And if you're going to cross a border, you need to have your broker as part of that overall process. That's part of the holistic supply chain evaluation. The next thing you get into is risk mitigation planning. So anytime you're dealing with customs, you're dealing with regulatory changes, geopolitical environments, duties, taxes, fees. We just heard about the Red Sea. So you always need to be aware of those risk mitigation and planning strategies. The next area is your cost transparency and accuracy. When you look at the import side of the house, really the brokerage piece, think of this as the main differentiator here is finance. Imports brokerage is all about duties, taxes, and fees, and what you can do from a duty minimization, duty avoidance perspective. So we always want to encourage you to make that part of your overall RFP process. And then the final piece here is customized solutions. And from a customized solution perspective, your freight forwarder, your broker, whoever you're working with from a supply chain perspective, you want to make sure that they can handle your specific requirements. So these are your standard operating procedures, your business rules. So if you have anti-dumping, if you have countervailing duty, exclusions, dealing with free trade agreements, you want to make sure that, number one, your broker and supply chain partners can execute on your behalf in any and all of those areas. As we move on to the next slide, what I really want to talk to you about here, really three key components. The first is end-to-end visibility. When we look at a supply chain in general and the overall dynamics in a supply chain, the number one requested attribute is visibility. And from a visibility perspective, you really have a couple of flavors of this. You want to understand where your customs clearance is at any given point in time, i.e., is it stuck at the border? Am I pending an exam? Things along those lines. But you also want visibility at the part and SKU level and at the document level. So if you ordered 500 widgets, you want to know, are 450 of those on the water, and what of those specific widgets are coming at you. So you want it from a part and SKU perspective. You also want it from a document perspective. So you want to make sure what you've got and asked for on your PO, you've got it represented on your commercial invoice, it's on your packing list, your ASN, all the way through the overall process. And what this leads to is really what we've got in the middle here is total landed cost insights. Okay. When you think about total landed cost, it's not just the purchase price. This is duties, taxes, fees, freight, insurance, currency conversion, other government agency reporting, if it's involved with your overall product. These are all cost and insights that you need to have on your overall platform and part of your RFP process so you can better evaluate how efficient and effective your overall supply chain is. And then finally, we have comprehensive reporting. Always like to focus on 5 key areas whenever you're talking about reporting. It's cost, quality, cycle time, customer satisfaction, okay, and compliance, okay? They're not in any order. Again, it's cost, quality, cycle time, customer satisfaction, and compliance. You want to have this reporting at the part and SKU level. So what this does is it allow you to make more accurate and more timely decisions as your supply chain is executing. And then also you want to manage and maintain your broker performance. Make sure that the accuracy and timeliness, speed, and of course, compliance continue to be key attributes that you measure from a supply chain execution perspective. As we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to really quickly here hit you with 2 or 3 different areas. First and foremost, whenever you're talking about your supply chain, right up here at the top, you as the importer and exporter of record bear all of the responsibility and liability related to crossing borders. Okay, so you need to have a platform and a process and supply chain partners, preferably during your RFP. You want to be looking for partners that are going to provide you with early identification of any exceptions, issues, or concerns so that you're aware of them and planning for them as quickly as possible. You also want to make sure that they've got good dialogue and good representation with CBP, so customs in general. So not only from a center of excellence perspective, they need to understand your overall products, but they need to have good working relationships at the port level. And then finally, there's the proactive communication side of this. So if you think about, as we've been talking here, the closed loop process in a supply chain, there's between the purchase order and final mile delivery, there's an average of 16 handoffs in any given supply chain. That's a lot of different parties that you have to coordinate in an international trade transaction to make sure they've got the right data at the right time. Having that on one common platform and one end-to-end RFP will benefit you from an overall business perspective. I do want to remind everybody too that you can ask questions off to the right here. So please feel free to ask your questions as we're going through today's discussion, because we're going to leave some time at the end to talk about that. We'll now move on to the next slide. A common theme here that you'll hear from me and from the RFP process just in general that you need to be looking for, especially for every business that's out there. We're all looking for ways that we can optimize our cost and our spend. We want real-time cost visibility. We want transparent invoicing, and we want to protect the business. And when I say protect the business, making sure that everything that you do is compliant, getting it out of a country and into a country. Those are kind of table stakes. But if you think about international trade, and every time you invoke an international trade process in the RFP season that's coming up now, what you do is you go through a process of anticipated landed cost. So when you sit down and you think, okay, I'm going to buy this specific product, and you want to do this at the SKU and the part number level, you anticipate the costs. So what is my cost of the individual product? What is my freight? What are my duties, taxes, and fees? Currency conversions associated with it, any fees to get it out of the country, any government agency reporting that you're going to have to do. And then what you get after you execute against your supply chain and you've actually done the import, you get your actual landed cost. Then what you want to do is compare your actual landed cost against estimated landed cost, and then work with your procurement organization, work with your supply chain partners on any of those variances to drive the most profitability and the most effective supply chain possible for you and your overall business. Okay. The next slide. What we're going to talk about here is 3 key areas for how you can get insightful customization just from your supply chain partners, in this case, your overall broker. Let's start on the compliance side. Some things that you should be looking for here is the capability of a very robust product library or a product catalog. Within that product library or that product catalog, what you really want to be storing there at the part and SKU level by country is all of the attributes that are going to be needed to move that product internationally. So this is not only your duty rate and HTS number associated with it, but it should also include manufacturer's affidavits, certificates of origin, if it qualifies for a free trade program, if there's an anti-dumping countervailing duty case associated with this specific product / classification. You want to call that out in your product library so you can use that as a source of truth. And as you bring documents and information into your platform or into your service providers, they can use this as a source of truth to validate your data and information. Now, the middle piece here is duty minimization, duty avoidance. Okay. As we talked about a little bit earlier, the big portion on the customs side of the house is all about duties, taxes, and fees in your financial supply chain, making sure you're maximizing that. Okay. Every country allows for duty minimization, duty avoidance capabilities. What those are specific programs that allow you to pay minimum or reduced duties, taxes, and fees. When I think about this from the US side of the house, there's about 11 of them that we tend to look at, but some big ones that are out there are duty drawback, using foreign trade zones, merchandise processing fee, doing the consolidation associated with that. There's tariff re-engineering, and of course, first sale. There's some others as well, but those are some of the big ones. And then finally, you get to the global network. From a global network perspective, you want to be able to, through your RFP process, allow all of your supply chain partners to be able to communicate effectively and efficiently, hopefully on a common platform that allows you to get the most out of your supply chain, again, as it starts from the PO and then goes through all the way through final mile delivery. As we move on to the next slide here, one of the things that we wanted to call out and I wanted to introduce you today is this concept of a control tower. So what you're seeing here from a graphic perspective is our landing page. It's 100% customizable. This happens to be to a demo account here, but you can structure this landing page to what makes sense for you and your overall business. And the intent here is to give you a holistic view of your entire supply chain. So from a brokerage perspective, just on the Flexport side of the house, we could manage all of your brokerage coming into the United States for the shipments and the goods moved by Flexport and those not moved by Flexport, and still give you the same look and feel. But regardless of whomever you're working with from an RFP perspective, you want to make sure that they can handle, especially on the import side of your house, all of your brokerage transactions from a business perspective. And I'll get into some of the rationale on that in a second here, okay, as we move on to the next slide. Okay. One of the last pieces I want to leave you with before we talk about some recommendations here is an ACE analysis. Now, ACE stands for the Automated Commercial Environment. Okay. In the United States, we have FOIA. It's Freedom of Information Act. Because we have FOIA and the Freedom of Information Act, what that means is you, as the importer of record, have access to your data and information filed with U.S. Customs by your IOR number. You could have multiple IOR numbers, but all of that data and information is available to you via a portal with U.S. Customs. Okay, you have access to that data and information. What they keep for you is the last 5 years plus year to date. So whenever you're importing, you want to demonstrate reasonable care. You want to be able to prove to Customs at any given point in time that, hey, you didn't turn a blind eye to the execution of your overall supply chain. So there's 4 areas that we always suggest you take a look at. First is classification. Classification is the cornerstone of trade. You get classification wrong, the ripple effect can be huge. So you want to look at how consistent you are or inconsistent you are from a classification perspective. You want to look for trade opportunities. This is recognizing the things that we talked about earlier, duty minimization, duty avoidance opportunities. This is your use of free trade agreements and programs, duty drawback, tariff engineering, MPF consolidation. Those are opportunities for you to reduce your overall spend, especially when it comes to duties, taxes, and fees. You want to look at your declarations. From a declarations perspective, you want to spot any anomalies, any declarations that have inconsistencies related to value, origin, and classification. Those are 3 key areas that all of the governments look at. And then finally, you've got government agencies. This is understanding what government agencies you are responsible for filling out additional data and information to: Fish and Wildlife, FDA, EPA. The list goes on. There's 40 some different agencies here. Also, if you have any anti-dumping or countervailing duty orders that potentially could be in place, those could be quite costly. You want to understand all of those. Drawback and recovery that we talked about earlier. And the final piece on this, why you want to consider having one single broker, is that any point in time, Customs could issue to you as the importer of record a CF-28 or a CF-29. That's a notice of action or request for information. And what you need to do is properly respond to that, but you can be considered from that point forward under audit with Customs. This is very appropriate to make sure if you ever have to do a prior disclosure, things along those lines, that you've properly attended to these. So just make sure whatever broker you're working with today, that you have a process in place for recognizing and following up on CF-28s and 29s. Now, as we move to the last slide here, before we go back to Zeid and Kyle here, is we want to also just offer to everybody here a free ACE analysis. So Flexport is offering at the very bottom here, you see there's an email address you can just reach out to. We are more than willing to do an ACE analysis with you. We do this by IOR, and we can roll this up from a parent-child relationship perspective. We'll go through all 4 of those categories that I spoke about earlier to be able to give that information back to you and hopefully identify some unique value drivers for your business for efficiency, effectiveness, and any abnormalities from a risk perspective, but also from a cost savings perspective. Okay. And Flexport does offer tariff re-engineering and restructuring for clients if somebody is interested in that as well. And again, I encourage you, please ask your questions on the right-hand side here. Now I'm going to turn back to Kyle and Zeid, who are going to talk about some RFP recommendations, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Bernie. Yeah, and to reiterate Bernie's last point there, please drop your questions in the Q&A in the right. We'll be getting to the Q&A here in just a minute. So first off, some key recommendations for this RFP season. So we're digesting some of what we talked about earlier. So first, definitely be patient with the Red Sea situation. We saw through that polling that most people do plan to wait and see where things settle. That's also where we would recommend before signing. It's still very early, and obviously we don't quite know what's going to happen over there, but we do expect that some of the current floating rates are reactionary to the situation, right? And so even if the situation continues, there will be a settling effect. Second, overall, you have to look at your own book of business and check out our beginner RFP where we talked a little bit more about this to consider both fixed rate levels. Is it a rate that makes sense, right? Rates to the US West Coast have skyrocketed. Would you want to lock that in for the rest of 2024? Probably not, right? Seasonality. What is your seasonality? Are you a spring shipper, a traditional peak season shipper? That does matter as you're locking in. And then finally, your commodity type. So all of these factor into determining your strategy. And as we talked about earlier, fixed rates aren't automatically cheaper than floating rates. So a lot of these factors about your own business will help determine whether that's true. With the expected volatility of this year, our recommendation is that importers do diversify their strategy across fixed and floating contracts, right? From a fixed perspective, some of the primary benefits are that rate projection, right, that you have for the annual year, but also the consistent sailing schedules that we talked about. Those don't exist, and we expect there to be overall a bit more volatility. So given that demand is up in question and where the supply will be, we think diversification will work best for most providers. Now, that balance of diversification will again depend on your own supply chain, and you're welcome to talk to your Flexport team about what that could look like. And then lastly, we talked about it with the suppliers, we talked about it with the IPIs, but certainly plan for inconsistent schedules, reliability this year. Whether this is importing a little bit extra to a plan for delays, or just having a diverse strategy that allows you to purchase space as needed. Schedule reliability, I don't think will return in 2024. We know, just given what's happening out there between the Red Sea and Panama, that for at least Q1, Q2, there will be some impact before the network stabilize, even if things cleared up today. And they're not going to clear up today. So plan for some inconsistent schedule reliability and make sure that you have options available for you. Zeid, I'll turn it over to you for some more recommendations.
Awesome. All right, everybody. I'm going to bring this thing home before we jump into to Q&A. So just want to leave everybody with a few kind of high-level strategies to think about. As you go through the next couple of months and you work on sort of building your RFQ, I really would encourage everybody to develop your own outlook on the market. Attending a call like this is a great starting point. But do your homework, do some research, really try to understand where is the market heading this year and how is it impacting your supply chain? What does demand for capacity look like for your manufacturing locations and your distribution locations? As an example, if you're on the East Coast, you're likely going to be more susceptible to the Panama Canal. If you're doing distribution in Europe, you're going to be susceptible to the Red Sea situation. So really try to understand the market and formulate a position on the market and how that's going to affect your supply chain. The second thing I'd recommend as well is really identify your supply chain priorities. Putting the volume data and requesting rates is really the easy part. I think really driving an effective RFQ entails communicating those supply chain priorities to your logistics partners. And really, what are you trying to accomplish? Cost is obviously at the top of everybody's agenda. But in addition to cost, are you looking to improve on-time performance? Are you looking to improve speed? A lot of shippers may even want to look to improve their commercial terms in terms of just working capital and cash flow. Maybe you're looking to diversify your carrier base. So really, think through those priorities, what they are, and it's really efficient and effective to get that communicated in your bid to the partners. That way we can provide a really robust response that's meaningful. Really understanding selection criteria is also important. So in terms of volume allocation, is the plan to stick with a single source model? Are you looking to use multiple providers? And how are you looking to allocate those volumes? Those types of insights in an RFQ really give Flexport and other forwarders the ability to be a little bit more thoughtful and strategic about our bid package and response, so we can really align our pricing and our strategy with what you're also looking at from an allocation standpoint. We see very commonly, bids get awarded and then implementation happens and things sort of fall off the rails. You really would encourage you to invest in implementation. Identify a single threaded owner within your organization that can work closely with your logistics partner, communicate timelines, and really work cross-functionally with all of your team members to get the business implemented so you can realize those procurement savings. I know everybody's got budget goals for the year. Getting things implemented and actualized is super important. So where we see this work is really where there's a single threaded owner from the shipper who really just spearheads that implementation process. And the last thing I'll leave you with before we jump into Q&A is the feedback loops. Many times you're putting an RFQ out to 8 to 10 different providers. Often there's probably 2 to 5 that receive some business. Really don't underestimate the impact that conversations have on the other 5 that maybe don't get business, right? And really driving that communication and feedback loop with them, and sharing your insights, sharing feedback with them on what worked and what didn't work is also a really important part of the process. As we all learned during COVID, these relationships are really important, and I would just encourage everybody to really drive those feedback loops with your logistics partners and sort of close the loop at the tail end of the RFQ process. All right, so with that, we're going to jump into Q&A. Looks like we've got 4 or 5 questions so far. So I'm actually going to start with Jim. Jim was kindly the first person to drop a question in the chat, so we're going to kick off with Jim. He's got a great question here. If we IPI from the U.S. East Coast, when labor comes up in September, would coming in via Montreal be an option? Kyle, I'm going to turn that one over to you.
Yeah, I can take that. So the answer is yes, potentially, but limited. So the reason I say potentially is we do have to keep in mind whether there will be sort of some unity agreements between the different labor unions there. So we did see that this year in Canada when they had their own labor negotiations. There was some agreements with labor in the U.S. where you couldn't offload containers that were bound for Canada in the U.S. initially, right? So that sort of limited some immediate response in terms of shifting containers from one place to another. But it's also limited because there are actually not many routings that go via Canada and into an IPI in the U.S. So if you're, in the Southeast, let's say you're going into Greer, there's not really routing that goes there geographically. But also the amount of sailings that are available, you mostly have to transship into Transatlantic westbound services. So they are out there, but it really depends on where you're shipping from for whether it'll be an option and where you're going to. For the most part, into the U.S., the best option would be to go via the West Coast, whether that's the U.S. or Canada.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. All right, great. So we've got a question from Jan. I love this question, kind of representing the small and medium-sized businesses. What are the implications of current market conditions for shippers from the startup to $50 million scale and $50 to $100 million scale? What should they look to do? Focusing more on those that aren't mega large shippers. And this is obviously a really growing segment within the industry, just given the big appetite for e-commerce, just in general. I think the direct answer to that question is probably access to capacity. Kyle, I'd love to get your take on this as well. A lot of the mega large shippers will sign direct contracts with the carriers, right? And typically the carriers will manage that capacity based upon revenue. So what ends up happening is the smaller shippers who may not sign contracts may have a hard time getting access to capacity. So what you may want to do to sort of combat that is, work with a forwarder. ideally Flexport. We'd love to work with you. But work with a forwarder and work to sign a fixed contract, or at least part of your capacity to a fixed contract, so you can de-risk that volatility in the market. That'll really help from a risk management standpoint. So when the market does get tight like it is today, and it likely will later this year, you've got that access to capacity, and you're not having to deal with delays. Kyle, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just one thing I'd add with that is I think the key thing to keep in mind, even if you're at this scale, is how consistent is your business, right? So if you do want to lock something in, there's expected to be some sort of consistency. But if you're expected rapid growth this year, on the floating market, you can purchase space as needed, right? And so if you're growing significantly month over month, then using the floating market to scale up and work with your conditions can actually be a great option to give you that flexibility to respond to your book of business.
Awesome. Great. We've got 2 customs questions for Bernie. So I'm going to start with the first one from Subash. What is tariff reengineering? I'd actually like to know the answer to that as well.
Yeah.
I'll turn it over to you, Bernie.
Yep. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. So tariff engineering, first of all, you're never supposed to try and come up with the overall duty rate just based on the customs fee or the customs duty rate. But having said that, there is a process called tariff reengineering. And from a tariff reengineering perspective, I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's say you have, and these are absolutely fictitious. Let's say you have a woman's dress, and that woman's dress is 51% polyester and 49% cotton. By definition, it's a polyester dress, so you're going to pay 16.8% duty associated with that. If you change the makeup to make that 51% cotton and 49% polyester, now it becomes a cotton dress, and your duty rate can fall from 16% to 8%, a 50% savings in this. You also want to look at packaging. So you could have, just by way of example, you could have a bassinet that's coming in from a foreign market, and that bassinet from a baby perspective has legs on it that attach to the floor. Because those legs attach to the floor, it's now considered potentially furniture associated with it. If you break those 2 apart and ship them in 2 different packages, you can bring them in at 2 different values and have a different duty rate associated with it. I'll go to a big one here, which would be, let's take a car. There's a big difference between a car that's a passenger vehicle or a commercial vehicle. There's about 20% in duty difference between the two. A commercial vehicle being more expensive, if you will. What determines a commercial vehicle is second row seats. So as long as you bring in something that has second row seats, you can qualify as a passenger vehicle. And then if you can reconfigure that after you've imported it, that is allowed as well. There's a lot of these little nuances that exist out there today, but Flexport would be happy to walk you through that process. I just decided to give you 3 quick examples.
Awesome, Bernie. Thanks.
Yep.
All right. Looks like we got 2 minutes left. Time for one more question. It's another customs question. So Bernie, this one's headed your way. This is from Matthew. What is a typical turnaround time to become ACE certified or approved?
So ACE certification. So again, it's completely required by law. As long as you have your IOR number, you can get this usually within 2 weeks. In one of the slides, I gave you the email address there. Just ping me the email via email, and I'll actually send you a 1-pager. And this is how you go and fill out the data and information. It's relatively painless. We're seeing turnaround times of 2 weeks. So within 2 weeks, you'll get access to a portal that'll give you access to your data and information. And then if you want, you can assign access, cross-portal access to me or someone on my team, and we can do that ACE analysis that I spoke of earlier. Okay.
All right, Kyle, back to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Bernie. So that concludes today's webinar. So thank you for the questions there. If you would like Flexport to help restructure your RFP bid process, please vote yes in the open poll on the right, and we'll be in touch. And a reminder that you can download the slides in the menu above your screen, and we'll email everyone a link to the recording and the slides tomorrow. Thank you again for joining, and hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.